Hey guys, on this week's episode of the podcast, we've got Dr. Randy Stone, who is a professor of education and the director of both the Doctor of Education and Doctor of Educational Ministries programs at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He's been working with pastors, associate pastors for a couple of decades now and has some great insights into where there can be some challenges and maybe how to deal with some of those challenges. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. We're excited to have you with us this week. This week, I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Randy Stone, professor of education and director of the Doctor of Educational Ministries and Doctor of Education programs at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. So, Randy, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be with you today.
I'm glad to have you here. And so just some background for everybody listening. Randy and I knew each other from way back before I finished my PhD down in New Orleans. I taught Sunday school for him when he was on staff at Southcliff Baptist Church in Fort Worth when I was a student at Southwestern, working on a master's degree back then. So, with that being said,
great people come through there. So,
yeah, it was a great experience. So, with that being said, why don't you talk a little bit about your ministry experience and your background?
Okay. Well, I'm originally from Southwest Louisiana and served when I was in college. Right after ministry-wise, I served several churches in my hometown. And then God dealt with me about my call. I was doing some secular work for a little while, worked in a chemical plant. I affectionately tell people I had a real job for 5 years. Then God dealt with me on that. Then I ended up going to pursue my master's degree, and then served churches in Kansas City. Went to Charlotte, served 2 churches in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. Back here to Baton Rouge in Louisiana, served 2 churches in Baton Rouge. And then I ended up at Southcliff in Fort Worth, Texas. And while I was doing all of that, I started working on my doctoral degrees and started teaching there at Southwestern as an adjunct professor and online at Liberty at University. And then got invited to come back here to New Orleans where I had received my PhD and been here I'm in my 13th year now.
Oh, very nice.
So,
all right. Well, as we mentioned, we kind of build this podcast around 2 core ideas. It's understanding what are the problems that people face in the pastorate, problems that ministerial staff face as they're dealing with people, as they're dealing with their call, and then what are some possible solutions to those issues. And so we come to that first question: what are some of the challenges you've seen or experienced yourself? Top maybe 2 or 3 in ministry.
Well, I would say one deals with, I guess, my personal life and what I see expressed in a little different way right now, and that is the idea of call. I know when I was serving and trying to just navigate what that meant, as I felt some sense of call. But what that meant for us, what type of job, am I going to be a pastor, minister of education, other type of jobs? There were a lot fewer options to most of us back then than there are now. And so part of that early stage was what do I want to do? And I had to come to a conclusion that felt like my ministry calling was primary in education, Christian education, and what that meant. And then that means, okay, where do I go get trained for that? How do I expose myself to that field and get better at it, that sort of thing. And what I see today is I went through that struggle and pursuing that. What I see among our students here today is they have had limited exposure to many of the options. There's so many options available, but they've had limited exposure to specific roles and responsibilities. So many of them have grown up through larger congregations and they've been in a children's ministry or youth ministry, and that's all they've known. The pastor is a distant person, maybe. Some of the behind the scenes jobs, which are critical in my estimation, are not visible to many of the students, so they don't know what a minister of education or discipleship pastor or some of the non-platform type jobs are. And so they come, they struggle with finding, they know they sent something, but they don't know what that is. and they've not been exposed to enough vocational type ministries to be able to refine their call. And the partner that goes with that is many of those young adults who feel called to ministry um, have never actually been an adult in church, functioning
Huh.
on committees or leadership. So they're coming with that sense of call and a great zeal, but really are not familiar with how churches function and make decisions and that sort of thing. So I think that's a significant challenge for many of the emerging ministers in today's world.
Yeah. So even as I'm thinking about that, and I think anybody who hears that, they're naturally going to reflect on their own call. Uh, I remember mine being fuzzy at first, right? I mean, when I knew at first that I was called to seminary, I didn't know what I was called to in terms of an actual position where I was going to land, what God was going to have me do. I'd been serving in student ministry for a while, which I wonder how many folks student ministry is a gateway to other
Yeah,
kinds of ministry
absolutely.
later on. And so I'd been serving in that capacity for a couple of years and knew I was feeling the tug to that I was supposed to go to seminary. And I was hearing it all over the place. God was making it really clear, no matter how hard I tried to resist at first, because I also had a real job and was thinking about it in that way.
Hmm.
Uh, and it wasn't until after I got to Southwestern that God showed me why exactly He'd called me there. Uh, and and through that, it's just an understanding that the call changes over time
Hmm.
to an extent. It might not drastically shift. Like I can still sense the same call now to serve that I sensed back then, but it's definitely shifted in how that's played out over the years. And gosh, as you're talking about young folks coming into the seminary, I wonder how much they're able to grasp that with the limited experience that they've got.
Yeah, and that's where I think pastors could really add such value to our all young adults by put them in places of leadership or service that they can try some different things on and explore what options are out there for them and get a sense of what how God may be shaping them to serve in a unique way and how that call might be manifested going forward. So I think churches sometimes somebody says, I feel called to ministry. Their issue is send them off to school to get trained when the
Yeah.
real training ground is the local congregation.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, right? I mean, because there's so much that you learn in the experience of actually serving in ministry that
Mhm.
you're just not going to get in a classroom in the same
That's
way.
right. Um,
Yeah,
so, so that's one of the big issues that I see. I guess partnered with that, I remember my first positions. I didn't know what I was doing. I just kind of repeated stuff I had seen done. I had no
yeah,
real clue about what I was doing,
yeah,
and the supervision that I got was pretty limited. Directions I got from my pastor doing youth work was very usually
yeah,
was more corrective. Hey, why'd you do that? The parents are
yeah,
mad at us. And I'm
yeah,
like, I'm 19 years old. I don't know what I'm doing. I needed
yeah.
direction. I needed some guidance and mentoring. And I'm not sure how many of our leaders and pastors know how to mentor and lead that way, or are willing to invest the time. And I think that's a pretty important part of that. So,
Yeah, you mentioned willing to invest the time. That's one of the things I was sitting here thinking about is it a conversation not only about willingness to invest the time, but actually having the time
mhm.
for a lot of our pastors, especially if, it sounds like your situation was similar to mine. I had you beat by a couple of years. I was 22 when I was starting in the student ministry, but uh, and I also just didn't grow up in church. So the things that I'd seen done was nothing. It was the few months that I'd been helping with the ministry before the person I replaced ended up leaving the position. And so, and that's actually, it was about a year that I volunteered and been serving there. But regardless, the sense of uh, in those smaller churches, you have pastors who are very busy, sometimes pastors who are bivocational these days. And they're also looking at, so what can we do to get a
Absolutely.
part-time youth guy in here? And coming alongside them and facilitating their call as well
But
starts
you'll
eating up
remember,
time.
Bill, when I was there at Southcliffe, we had about 10% of the student population from the school was in our church.
Oh yeah,
And so some of them had experience, but many of them didn't had limited or none. And if you
yep,
remember, I created a program called a Ministry Associate Program, and I met with as any of the students who were willing. We met once
Yep.
a month as a group, and then I would meet with them one on one some other times. And I gave them a title, authority, responsibility, and accountability. And I gave them part of my job, which freed me up. I say, okay, I'm going to give you this that takes me 5 hours a week. You're going
Yeah.
to manage it. You're going to run it. And it gave them experience leading under my direction. And that
Yeah.
then freed me time up to spend time with them on an individual basis. And that was how I was able to maximize my effort that way.
So, okay, so here's what I'm hearing then in terms of real practical application, the idea of if if that pastor who is flying solo and they're real busy, if they can think of it in a ministry associate mindset, which, for most pastors, they're not, you know, 3 blocks away from one of the largest Southern Baptist
That's
seminaries
right.
around. And so they're not going to have that same number of people that they're working with. They're going to have a few here and there that are interested in maybe transitioning into ministry. And also depending on the extent to which they preach
Mm-hmm.
into that and facilitate the idea of being called into ministry. And so if they can develop it in that way and actually just give them part of what they do, which even as I'm saying it, I'm realizing there are pastors who are immediately going, I don't know that I can give them anything of what I do. It's
Well, if we trained them up, we have to trust them and then equip and empower them. That's what we need to be doing, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and then hold them accountable for it. And hey, listen, not everybody's a rose at the end of the day. There's some thorns you work through.
yeah, yeah.
So,
That happens.
but I think this it's the essential if we're going to maximize our time. But investing in a couple people that you may sense feel called in your church can you can begin to delegate out some things that you may not even be good at. They may be better at it if you
Yeah,
really test the waters on that. So
yeah,
it can add hours back to your week to do other things if you manage it right.
yeah. It can multiply some things out and really start to multiply your time. I love that idea. That's in fact that's something that I'll write a resource connected to that idea just to have up on the website for pastors to be able to think through. Um, so that's a big one. The idea of uh, you know guys are rolling into our seminaries and they might have a sense of call, but it's
Hmm.
kind of generic. They don't,
Hmm.
and it doesn't have some of the same meat behind it in terms of understanding real world ministry in the church and what that looks like. A
Yeah,
little bit of a pie in the
yeah.
sky view.
I used to call it nuts and bolts of ministry. What's the nuts and
Yeah.
bolts to make this stuff work? Because even in seminary, we're busy talking theology and biblical studies, and
Oh yeah.
then you come in and you say somebody's got to change the toilet paper at the church, and who's that going to be? And in many of our churches, it's the pastor if there's nobody else there to do it.
Yeah.
How do you find time for that project?
Yeah. Yep. Do you know where it is and where it's stored? All that kind of
And the
stuff.
coffee on Sunday morning is more important than your sermon outline
Yeah, but
to the members.
I have a feeling most pastors know where the coffee is if they're anything like I know I have been in ministry. So, uh, okay, so that's one idea. What other things have you seen as far as
Well, I
challenges
think
in the
the
ministry
other
world?
one that I would been as I prepared thinking about this is I think in years past the training for pastors was largely around I would say three things: um, preaching, pastoral care, and program management.
Mm,
And in our Baptist life or Southern Baptist life and many denominations, they have programs that have been adopted by the denomination or the whatever the group,
yeah.
and those uh, whether intentional or unintentional, the curriculum that you use, whatever, often has a basic program approach to doing church. And that's how we were trained. Many of my generation was trained to be program managers. But the 70s and 80s and 90s brought such change culturally and structurally and everything else. And I think today's pastors now have to be much more focused as ministry strategists working
Mm,
on process and principles that are somewhat fluid rather than managing a program. And even the preaching and the pastoral care, those things can be done in maybe different ways, but they have to be ministry strategists and how they're responding to the cultural, sociological, organizational, generational changes that we're surrounded by.
okay. So, can you help me think through a specific example of what that looks like? What you mean there?
Okay, let's take one for example. Sunday school is was popular for many
Yep.
churches. A lot of them still do it. Um, I'm not even sure that name resonates with today's generation. Sunday means it's got to be on Sunday. School is not something they particularly enjoy. So, but the
Yep.
minute you change the name of something like that, now what's the identity and the purpose of that
Hmm.
organization? What's the group? Most of our groups do not even know why they meet. And I go in to do consults works with all the, and so we have all these ministries that are maybe residual of something past or got started under a previous pastor as a
Yeah.
program element, and we never stop and say, what's the return on investment of this program or ministry?
Yeah.
And where meanwhile the world around us is changing, and what we did 50, even 10 years ago may not be relevant anymore to the current changes in our environment. Or are there new pockets of people we need to reach in a different way that are around our church? We got to
Yeah.
stop and say, who is that and how are we doing that? And pastors can easily get on a do the same thing we did last week, last month, last year without stopping to say, are we making the most of the resources God has given us, money and people and time, to
Yeah.
make an impact for the kingdom?
Yeah, it's a stewardship question in a lot of ways. I mean, we only have so many resources, especially when it comes to the time we have to spend in a given week.
Hmm.
We have a limited set. Uh,
That's
we've
right.
got, if you sleep like a normal person, about 110 to 115 hours a week, and that's it. That's all you got.
That's all
And
you got.
so, to stop and ask the question, why are we doing what we're doing? Are we benefiting? And I think about that word, use the word relevant. That's a place where I think it's easy for us to get hung up, because we hear relevance and we think about the gospel. It's like, well, the gospel is always relevant. It's just what is what it is. Yes, that's true, but the vehicle by which you deliver the gospel to folks
That's
isn't
right.
always relevant. That's something that wanes. And so, and I don't. I mean, the idea of being able to recognize people for who they are, where, uh, you know, not where, how things have changed, how people have changed as populations move. Uh, it's really about being the living church, recognizing who people are, who's around you, and how to meet them where they are with the gospel that always has the good news and never changes.
Bill, I was thinking about, I probably need to write an article on this. As I was preparing, I was thinking about 4-lane highways.
Yeah.
Uh, and that came to mind because I'm driving a lot, I commute and stuff, but I was thinking a 2-lane highway or a 4-lane highway was a solution to a crowded 1-lane highway or a two-way highway, right?
Yeah.
And for years, those we found relief from that. We're now living in a world that's 4 lanes on both sides,
Yep.
and most of our churches are still operating on a 2-lane or a 4-lane highway. And we said, well, it was a relief when 20 years ago when we were had these factors and variables in our church, but now we're surrounded by multi generations, multi ethnics,
Yep.
socioeconomic changes, all those kind of things. How do I navigate? And I need 4 lanes on both sides. And I'm in Baton Rouge. I drive through Baton Rouge frequently here in New Orleans. We
Yep.
have lots of bridges, and when they go from 6 or 8 lanes going in to 2 lanes to get across the bridge, you can only get so many people across the
Yep.
bridge, no
Yep.
matter how many lanes you got on either side of it.
Yep. You're going to hit a bottleneck.
And so I see churches like that. It's like they've got the world that's coming in with these multi lanes factors, but our churches are still operating with these 2 and 4 lane enterprises.
Yeah, I think about that same. I've been thinking about that same idea, but in the context of education. One of the things I was just reading the other day, I was looking at who our new freshmen really are, and that's easy for me to get my head wrapped around, frankly, because I have one. My middle one is a freshman in college this year. He was born in 2004 at the very end. If we look at kids born end of 2004 through the beginning of 2005, the world they grew up in is very, very
Different.
different from the world that a lot of their predecessors grew up in. YouTube came out in 2005. Uh, the iPhone came out in 2007. That's just a couple of years after they were born. When we start thinking about these kids, other things that happened in 2005, that was the year that both Dan Rather and Ted Koppel retired. Names that you and I know, and none of our freshmen here at SBU do. And so they've grown up in a world, for example, where they get all of their news pretty much from YouTube and TikTok and a little bit of Instagram, maybe mixed in for fun. Uh, it's just not the same. But if you're trying to deliver information to them in the same way you delivered information 25 years ago, they're going to think it's boring and they're not going to get it in a lot of ways. And so the message might be the same, but the vehicle by which we deliver that message has got to change because people have changed. The world has changed, let alone a conversation we could have about how much things have changed just since COVID, right?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
if it was 2019 and we were in June and I said I zoomed into class today, that means I drove real, real fast. And it doesn't have anything to do with how we think of zooming into class or zooming into church today.
Yeah. And if interestingly, even the Zoomers are older people who avoiding being around people, not young people using it
Yeah.
as a connection device. So
Yeah. It's
yeah,
interesting,
it
and
is.
it ties into some of what we're talking about here. When I think about the idea of connecting with folks in new ways, when I think about the challenges of not understanding the ins and outs of some aspects of ministry, a lot of it comes back to people. One of the things I just saw an article on Lifeway Research the other day that talked about the idea. You know what? If you want to get people back in church who are still virtual, it's about the pew and not about the pastor. It's relationships that get it done. And so to be able to cultivate good relationships with folks is just vitally important. And that's what keeps us in touch with how to deliver things well, is not relationships in our church, not only relationships in our church, but relationships with our community surrounding our church. So we know who it is we're trying to evangelize.
And Bill, you're younger than I am, so I can go back in another generation. And the time that I grew up, post World War II, as a child, I was 50s and 60s. Communities were shared. I mean, we had usually one school, elementary school, one
Yep.
high school. You go look at neighborhoods across America. They built a neighborhood, and in it they had this neighborhood, and they put a Baptist or Methodist church in it, and an
Mm-hmm.
elementary school in it. And usually they were in the back of the neighborhood,
Yep.
and everybody in that neighborhood went to church together, went to school together, played on the same baseball teams.
Yep.
So coming to church on Sunday mornings was an extension of the rest of my community life. My
Mm.
third grade Sunday school teacher was my fourth grade school teacher or whatever.
Yeah.
There was integration from those things. Now we're compartmentalized across every place sociologically.
Yep.
So how we connect people and help them develop those relationships in a very positive way. And it's countercultural to America, which is in
Oh
a
yeah.
car on the drive to, I'm going to carve out time, significant time to meet with these other people and be in their life. And
Yep.
it's counterculture to what we're being told on other sides.
Yeah. Yeah. And counterculture to what's being promoted across the board. So much so that sense of individualism has progressed so far that it's not uncommon to see two people sitting on couch right beside each other, but each on their phones staring at stuff, not necessarily making eye contact. I've seen instances of kids where they'll be texting one another and they could turn their head and look and make eye contact, but they're still staring at their phone. It's crazy just how much things have changed in that way.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so being able to
So,
recognize these are the people that we're ministering to, and I'm just going to throw this
and
out
many of
there.
our churches are multiple generations, so that
Yeah.
even dealing with one generation or two is challenging. Some have four or five of these generations, and how do you bring some sense of unity about the mission of the church and the
Yep.
purpose of the church, at the same time, the unique needs of each of those different segments of the congregation?
Yeah, which I'll say with those segments of the congregation, I'm talking about younger folks a lot and being on their phones, and it sounds like I'm throwing them under the bus. Parents, and this is my generation, are just as bad, every bit as bad as being on their phone and not paying attention and listening to things that need to be listened to. It's just as bad by a long shot.
Well, and here's another nuance that goes with that. The church we serve, we're in together. had 40 people from 40 countries with 30 different language groups.
Yeah.
And so you throw in those cultures and those, and where, and I, everywhere I go now, and I do a lot of church consulting and stuff. I'm like, every community has a different ethnic or racial group in their community of some kind, and either may or may not feel connected to the local congregations,
Yep.
but there's a mission field, a ministry field out there that often goes untapped with those. So how do you bring those groups, or help Christianity prevail in those communities in spite
Yep.
of those multi-generational and multicultural connections?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so here are the things that I'm hearing. As we're talking about a couple of high level problems that can show up that you've seen among students at one of our 6 Southern Baptist seminaries.
Mm-hmm.
We see issues with not necessarily understanding the fullness of what ministry is, and we've got a solution for that. And the idea of, if you can create somebody as a ministry associate, and you're training them, and there's some mentoring that's going on, that can be really valuable. And for our pastors, whether you're at a big church like the one where you and I were together, what was Southcliffe at that time? About 5,000, somewhere between 2 and 5,000, wasn't
Well, we ran on Sunday mornings about 15 to 1800 on campus, and
it?
we
Okay.
had 7,500 members and
Okay.
attenders on the books. So there were, and it was a big
Yeah.
churn.
Yeah. Big mix. Big mix. Okay. So, a lot of the churches around aren't that size, right? And so, whether you're that size or you're the much smaller church, even bivocational, then this is a value add in doing having a ministry associate, that you can get them doing some things in ministry. It takes something off of your plate. It gives you room to invest in them, and it gives them practical experience, which is highly valuable. The other thing we're talking about is, as we connect with other people and we start thinking about the connections with our community, and whether we're doing what we ought to be doing. And the common phrase these days, like you used, was return on investment. What is the return on investment in the way we are doing ministry with our limited resources? So stewarding well our time, our financial resources, our people. I mean, we only have so many volunteers. And so
That's
are
right.
we stewarding well in those ways? And so how would you talk about that? I mean, it seems like there has to be some kind of systematic review to be intentional about reflecting on what we're doing, and how to just constantly improve in that way.
Yeah, I think you just have to, you have to stop the merry-go-round periodically and just ask those questions. Why are we doing this? What's it helping us do? Is God still? Do we still have the resources to it? Because what you have the resources for one ministry, if the wrong people or the right people move, and you
Yep.
don't have leaders, but we're trying to prop it up with somebody who does no longer has passion or giftedness to lead something, then it just
Yeah.
becomes work. And helping people lead out of their giftedness and their callings and their passion for men, that's one of the things. And so doing that regular evaluation of what are we doing it, why are we doing it, how's it,
Yeah.
do we have the resources, what's it been, how's it benefiting the church or helping the church grow and fulfill its mission. Like one of the things I do now is I don't ask people, would you like to serve in our organization?
Yeah.
I just go ask them, what you passionate about?
Mm.
And then I
Yeah.
say, how do we help turn that into a kingdom effort? How
Yep.
to, as a leader, how do I take your interest in this thing, this passion for this, and integrate it into the church life?
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
it's kind of flipping the script on things
Yeah.
from I got the program, I got to feel, to I got people, I got to empower and equip and empower.
Yeah. Yep. 100%. And so here, the one thing I think with that is, if the pastor, how do I put this? The pastor's got to have some lead role in making sure that the merry-go-round gets stopped once in a while and those questions are asked. But to do that, there also has to be a recognition that those questions aren't ornery. that sometimes it's easy to feel like, well, we've done this for 15 years. How dare you even ask why we do? And that's not the right way to approach those kinds of questions. Those questions are just top level. If I think through, you know, uh, Pat Lencioni's 6 Types of Working Genius, these are wonder questions. These are the top 30,000-foot level questions. Why are we doing what we're doing? Is there a better way to consider doing this? Are we fulfilling the mission we're called to fulfill by doing this activity? Uh, is this the best way to steward our resources? Asking those questions is important. It matters. And it's not a bad thing to stop and consider that. even though, especially if it was somebody's passion project and they're still around, but there's a whole bunch of people who aren't as passionate about it anymore, that can feel like an attack to have that question asked. And it can't
Yeah.
be interpreted that way. And the pastor's got to be the one who leads out in setting that bar, that it's not honorary to ask those questions. It's not. It's in fact a good thing to do that kind of evaluation.
And Bill, I would say, if you talk about this, that return on investment, making that investment to work through that with your people and your
Mm,
church will reap results in terms of morale and energy and effectiveness. Because if you can, I mean, it's like if we're doing programs or ministries, it's like carrying a backpack full of rocks. If it's not ours, if somebody else started it, initiated it, I'm not passionate about it. I may
yep.
do it out of obligation. It's hard to run when I got 50 pounds of back. But if I can say, hey, let's run the course that we now have set before us, the one
Yep.
that God's called us to now, then I'm ready
Yep.
to run on that. And now there's an energy and synergy that comes with that. And then the whole ministry is elevated. And it's a little hard work to get there. But that's why I think the role of the pastor's got to change from the program manager to
Yeah.
the strategist
To the
and
strategist.
empowering people.
Yep. I think that's great. And so, and again, when the pastor's the one who's doing it, that's what sets the atmosphere that makes, and so it can be a hard lift at first, but once you're there and that's the atmosphere that's in place,
That's right.
that can stay in place.
I was just going to say, I think for me, part of this is as you empower people or you release people, it means that you have to cut some things out. You have to stop doing things in order to add. You can't, and that's what I
Yeah.
see a lot of our smaller churches about small church pastors. They
Mm-hmm.
want to operate if they were bigger at one time. They want to have all the programs and ministries they had when they ran 200 and now
Yep.
they're running 100. It's impossible to be effective at that.
Yeah.
And so somewhere's you got to have a legitimate, real. We have economic downturns. You got to cut your budget back. You got to
Yep.
be real with that and not idealistic about some of what you're going to have. But if you do that properly, and we're seeing that right now coming out of COVID, the
Yep.
churches who were intentional about using that time to evaluate their ministries and programs and said, let's only add back the things that are helpful
Yep.
to our health as a church are doing well. The ones who said, let's get back to status quo as fast as we can
Yep.
are still struggling, trying to get back
Yeah.
to status quo.
Yep. Yep. It's like there's the wrong goal in mind. The status quo is being lifted above what is the mission right now? What does God have for us right now? Uh,
Well, somebody said at a meeting I was at a long time ago, so I've quoted him, and he said, never underestimate the amount of energy people will expend to preserve status quo.
mm,
And that's been very true in my ministry. Is so
yep.
it takes loving coaching to move people along. But once they get where you want them to go, they're often delighted that they went with you.
Yeah.
But moving them there can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. Randy, this has been great. Thank you. I think this has been really valuable conversation. I appreciate you being on.
All right.
Any final thoughts you want to share before we?
Well, I just want to encourage. I know sometime I work with a lot of young adults, and I have my moments sometime that I um, may be critical of their naivete or their thinking. But
Yeah.
man, I think back when I was young and dumb, I did stupid stuff, said stupid stuff. But we cannot replace the zeal
Oh, yeah.
that youthfulness brings, and the enthusiasm. If we can just channel some of that into the kingdom work that God wants, and as older people, we need to mentor those younger people and give them those clear paths for success. I think that works.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Randy. And for all of you listening, thank you for being here with us. We'll have another episode next week.